So, picking it back up, we had just finished discussing conflict management, right? And now we're going to talk about some of the strategies to resolve that. They're generally considered five or six or so, right? Your organization may have others. Confronting is one, and that's really about problem solving, getting to the root cause. And that really is considered best. Compromising, right? Reconciling, right? Just making sure everybody's satisfied is generally considered a lose-lose approach. Withdrawal or avoidance is usually not the best, though there are times if somebody's violent that withdrawal or avoidance becomes the best at the moment. Smoothing is more like accommodating. You're emphasizing agreement. There's collaboration, right, where you build a consensus and you incorporate multiple views. And then another approach would be forcing, directly pushing your view. That is considered the absolute worst. So it's still an approach and sometimes absolutely necessary. So there's a picture of the slide from the text. These are my notes from other lectures, and I just think that there's a compare and contrast that's useful. And notice that a combination of these is often the best possible approach. Now, so conflict is going to happen whenever we begin a project and work through a project. In fact, Tuckman has the stages of team development, and they go by these terms. You form, so it's forming, storming, norming, performing, where you want to try and get to be a high-performing team, and then adjourning, or it's actually adjourning, but the only way to make it rhyme is to say adjourning. Forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Those are the stages that you can expect a team to go through, and they can go back and forth within it, right? And so you want to avoid conflict, but note that the team is changing throughout the effort, right? And so there are four main issues. We saw the top 7 problem types. The four main issues are technical objectives, commitment of others to the project, the priorities set, and then the organizational structure that you have to work within. We're going to talk about those. Again, the organizational structures. Later, we'll talk about functional organizations, projectized organizations, matrix build organizations, etc. Those create advantages and also conflicts. So in the project build-up, for example, it tends to be a technical approach that's the conflict. There will also be conflicts between you and the functional areas, right, as you're trying to negotiate for resources. During the main project itself, the schedule becomes the main source of conflict. Halfway through the project, the schedule by research data is the number 2 point of contention or issue. But at the halfway point and beyond, schedule is the number 1 point of contention that will eat up most of your time, especially if you're working towards an annual strategic goal. So some tasks will be late and schedule has to be adjusted. That's what you're doing. Remember that iron triangle we looked at last week? That was about making trade-offs between schedule, cost, and scope, amongst other things. And technical conflicts are going to be at the center of that. During the project closeout, right, it's about the deadline. At this point, technical problems are less cumbersome, and mostly it's personality conflicts at that point, and as we wrap up the project. And then when we deal with conflict, in a general sense, you can go from assertive to unassertive or cooperative to uncooperative, and that refers back to the source, the solutions for conflict, the confronting, the withdrawing, that we looked at just a few slides back. It can take that general approach. Okay. So what we're doing then with those approaches is to negotiate. We're negotiating, even in problem solving, right? We are employing, as project managers, interpersonal skills to make sure that we hear everyone, that everyone gets a voice, that we get to root cause. And again, we only jump in when it's impacting project objectives. Otherwise, you want to let others work through the issues and, just monitor the situation, right? The three common situations that call for negotiating, this will often happen with subcontractors. It'll often has as an input from some of the functional managers. And another way would be in change management. Now, I throw in this slide just not to study for the paper or any exam, but just as a sense of, how does change management really work? So on the left, before I have a baseline, a baseline that I want to control, a schedule baseline, a scope baseline, a cost baseline, something in the iron triangle with a baseline, I want to build my configuration plan, right? What is configurable about the deliverables and the processes that I'm working in, right? What artifacts am I looking for? And then once I form these baselines, I want to make sure I stand up in red the ICC, Integrated Change Control, where all the key players can come to a table on a set interval or by invitation to assess changes to the project. So I want to make sure I've established a CCB, a Change Control Board, as part of this overall change control system, right? And then when the results, I always want to communicate that to the stakeholders. Again, back to meeting their needs, their expectations, as that drives project success. And then I want to implement the change and make sure I do what Deming would ask of us, which is plan, do, check, and act. And this process will help mitigate any of the conflict that comes from changes. Now, in a project, I'm also always interested in partnering, right? Especially with contractors. Contractors become a key part of the conflict. There is in the textbook steps to address partnering, so please be sure to review those. Okay. I will, and because we're a team. Let me just go back to that and say we're a team together. And through this team effort, so where I work, there are people, and by law, the corporate guidance is do not involve contractors in employee activities. Well, I got it. There's a productivity concern. But at the same time, if I exclude contractors from cake cutting for birthdays and things, I am alienating them and disrupting the team, breaking down the team. And as a project manager, that is difficult to do because I'm trying to unify and align things. So here's kind of what I'm trying to unify. So we started to talk about this last week, and I bring it up again, right? So we have these business documents in the bubble, which include the business case and the benefits management plan. And that's coming from the C-suite. And the project manager is going to take that with the team that you've been given or you've negotiated for, whoever you can put together with your sponsor, and you're going to develop a project charter. And what you're doing is you're taking this super high level, very wide business case and benefits management plan, which would incorporate the net present value, the return on investment, your feasibility study, etc. You're boiling it down to a high-level project charter. Charter is always high-level, but it's useful. So here's an example. It'll list high-level risks, high-level requirements, high-level assumptions and constraints. What's a high-level requirement? Well, if my project is to build the Golden Gate Bridge, it would be to connect San Francisco to the piece of land across the bay. It would be 8 lanes for each side with a bike lane and a walking lane included to support the weight of at least 400 vehicles and 29 million tons, that sort of thing, right? Those are They're high level, but they're measurable. That's the point I wanted to make. A charter's going to have measurable objectives. Okay? And this is leading then to our plan, which will be very detailed and will produce our project deliverables, right? And doing this is about eliminating conflict, avoiding change, right? That often causes conflict. In fact, 3 types of change I wanted to just mention are scope change, scope creep, and scope gap, right? Understanding change is about understanding and controlling scope. So scope creep is this uncontrolled, many of us are familiar with this term, right? This is uncontrolled expansion of the product or project scope without adjustments to time and cost, etc. In fact, it's adding functionality to the project that isn't called for at all, right? And so through change management or change control. And so we want to work to avoid that. That's going to have damaging impact on our project, right? At the same time, we have scope gap, right? Scope gap is when a requirement is not fulfilled or delivered. And most of the time, scope gap happens because you run too fast from the beginning and didn't take the time to identify all the requirements. And of course, scope can change through the change control process, so something we want to keep an eye on because we're always using that change control process, right? We are always, this project by definition is unique and time bound, right? So we are always using progressive elaboration and then change control to implement recommended changes if they are approved through the change control process. So this is something you'll want to keep your eye on. Now, so some requirements and principles of negotiation, right? It's few conflicts have to do with whether or not the task is going to be undertaken. A lot of times it has to do with the design or the technical aspects, right? And the work of the project should get done, right? Because in the end, if not, everyone loses, especially the project manager. You are ultimately responsible, was one of the notes on the previous slide, which talked the roles and responsibilities, right? So these things then cause more conflict, right? Requirements for the, and so we have requirements for conflict reduction, right? Creating those win-win situations, right? How do we settle the objectives? And of course, we covered some strategies previously on how to do that. Okay, that wraps up Chapter 4. We'll just kick off to Chapter 5, and then we'll take a quick break. This is about the organizational structures that help support the project, right? We have to work within the company we have and the organizational structure type, but to understand them helps us understand our power. And understanding our power helps us get the project accomplished, right? Through these various organizational types. There are more than this, but in general, there's a functional, projectized matrix, or a composite type organization. So a functional project organization, it goes by the nickname a silo, right? It's straight up and down. And you work for a functional manager, which we said earlier, owns the resources. And this is where the project manager will get most of them. And so they often assign people to your project. So if you have a good working relationship with a functional manager or two, you can sometimes then negotiate a request, right? And this is what a functional organization might look like. You can see it's siloed up and down, and the project manager goes up through one functional manager basically and over and down if they want to talk or work with someone else. There are advantages to this, of course, and disadvantages to the process, right? Responsibility becomes one of the key ones. The project manager generally has very little control. Most of the control, especially in the budget, is with the sponsor and or the functional manager as they own the resources. Okay, I'm going to stop there and we'll pick up with projectized organizations next.